The Duke married her to give his son a mother, but she gave him a family he never dreamed of. The 7-year-old boy stood in the doorway of his father's study, tears streaming down his pale cheeks, and whispered the words that shattered the Duke of Ashburn's carefully constructed world. "Papa, why did Mama leave me? Was I not good enough to stay for?" In that moment, watching his son crumble under the weight of abandonment, Marcus Thornfield, war hero, peer of the realm, man of unshakable resolve, felt something inside him break so completely that he knew he would never be whole again. His late wife had died giving birth to their son, but the boy had been told a gentler lie, and now that lie had been poisoned by a cruel cousin's whispered truth. The child's faith in love itself was dying before his eyes, and Marcus had no weapons against this particular enemy. Wait before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. Marcus dropped to his knees on the Persian rug, a posture no duke should ever assume, and pulled his son against his chest. The boy's thin shoulders shook with sobs that seemed too large for his small frame. "Oliver," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, "your mother loved you more than her own life. She gave everything so you could be here. Never doubt that." But even as he spoke, Marcus knew the truth that haunted the halls of Ashburn Manor. His son was drowning in a house full of servants and empty of warmth, surrounded by tutors and governesses who came and went like the seasons, none able to fill the chasm where a mother's love should dwell. The boy barely ate, rarely smiled, and had begun having nightmares that left him screaming in the dark. The physicians called it melancholia. Marcus called it his greatest failure. That night, after Oliver had finally fallen into fitful sleep, Marcus stood in his late wife's portrait gallery, staring at Amelia's painted face. They had married for duty, produced an heir as expected, and she had paid the ultimate price. He had respected her, even grown fond of her, but love? No, that had never been part of their arrangement. "I don't know how to save him," Marcus admitted to the portrait, to the empty room, to the ghost of a woman who had deserved better than to be forgotten by her own child. "He needs something I cannot give. Perhaps. What he needs," came a soft voice from the shadows, "is someone who understands what it means to be unwanted." Marcus spun, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword that no longer hung at his hip. A woman stepped into the candlelight, and he recognized her immediately. Eleanor Hartwell, the vicar's daughter, the woman the village called the spinster saint with equal parts admiration and pity. "Miss Hartwell, how did you—" "Your housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, sent for me. She thought perhaps I might be able to help." Eleanor moved closer, and Marcus saw that she carried a worn leather book. "I've been reading to the children at the parish school. Oliver used to come, before—" She trailed off, but they both knew what she meant. Before the boy had withdrawn so completely that even the simple joy of stories with other children had become impossible. Marcus studied her in the flickering light. Eleanor Hartwell was not beautiful in the conventional sense. At 28, she was considered well past marriageable age, too tall, too serious, with dark hair always scraped back in an unfashionable bun, and gray eyes that seemed to see too much. She wore a faded blue dress that had been mended multiple times, and her hands were chapped from work. But there was something in her bearing, a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength. "What do you know of unwanted children, Miss Hartwell?" The question came out harsher than he intended. She didn't flinch. I know that I was the daughter my father received after my mother died bearing me. I know what it is to grow up in a house where every floorboard seems to whisper that you cost too much. I know what it is to be loved dutifully but not warmly. Her voice remained steady, but Marcus saw her fingers tighten on the book. And I know that children can survive without warmth, but they cannot truly live without it. The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. What would you have me do? I cannot manufacture affection. I cannot. He stopped, the words catching in his throat. I am not a warm man, Miss Hartwell. No, she agreed, but you are a desperate one. And desperation makes men capable of choices they would never otherwise consider. Something in her tone made him turn to face her fully. In the candlelight, her gray eyes held a challenge. What are you proposing? Eleanor lifted her chin. Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible and yet somehow inevitable. Marcus felt his breath catch. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious. She moved closer, and he caught the scent of lavender and old books. You need a mother for your son. I need to escape a future as my brother's unpaid housekeeper, watching him drink away the parish funds while his wife makes my life a daily misery. We would both gain something from this arrangement. You would marry a man you do not love? Tie yourself to a marriage of pure convenience? A bitter smile touched her lips. Your Grace, I have lived 27 years without anyone finding me worthy of love. I have made peace with that particular disappointment. But I have not made peace with being useless. Oliver needs someone who understands loneliness. I understand it better than most. Marcus should have dismissed her immediately, should have called Mrs. Davies to escort her out and reprimanded his housekeeper for this presumption, should have done anything except what he did, which was to hear himself say, "And what would you want in return, beyond escape from your brother's household? Security, respect, the freedom to read and walk and think without being told I'm wasting time that should be spent on needlework and gossip, a library card to your collection, which I'm told is extensive." She paused, and her voice softened. "And the chance to make a difference in one child's life. That alone would be worth any sacrifice." "You do not know what you would be sacrificing," Marcus said roughly. "I am not a kind man, Miss Hartwell. I am cold, demanding, and damaged by war. My nightmares wake the household. My temper is legendary. And I have absolutely no intention of pretending this would be anything more than a business arrangement." "Good," Eleanor said simply. "Pretense is exhausting. I would prefer honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." They stood facing each other in the portrait gallery. Two people so damaged by life that they had almost stopped hoping for anything better. And Marcus felt the strangest sensation, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to make a leap that would either save him or destroy him completely. "If we did this," he said slowly, "if we actually did this insane thing, it would be a marriage in name only. I would require an heir eventually, but there would be no pretense of affection between us, no romantic delusions. You would be Oliver's mother in all practical ways, but you and I would be merely associates." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I understand completely, and I accept your terms." "Just like that? You would bind yourself to a loveless marriage, to a man who cannot give you warmth, for a child who may never accept you?" "Just like that," she confirmed. "Because the alternative is to watch my brother's wife work herself into an early grave while I'm told I should be grateful for their charity. Because I'm tired of being invisible. And because She glanced toward the door, where somewhere in the vast house a 7-year-old boy lay tormented by nightmares. Because no child should feel unwanted. If I can prevent that, even a little, then yes, I would bind myself to this marriage. Marcus felt something shift inside him, some small crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. You are either very brave or very foolish, Miss Hartwell. Perhaps both, she said with a ghost of a smile. But then, so are you, for considering this proposal. He turned away, staring once more at Amelia's portrait. His first wife had been everything society deemed appropriate, beautiful, accomplished, from an impeccable family. And their marriage had been cordial but empty, producing one child and very little joy before ending in tragedy. Eleanor Hartwell was none of those things. She was too old, too plain, too poor, too educated for her station. She would be mocked by society. His peers would pity him or laugh at him for such an unsuitable match. And yet, one condition, Marcus said, not turning around. You will have complete authority over Oliver's upbringing. No governess, no tutor, no servant in this household will override your decisions regarding my son. If you are to be his mother, you will be so in truth, not merely in name. I accept. And you will be honest with me, always. Even when, especially when, it is difficult. I cannot abide liars or sycophants. That will not be a problem, Your Grace. I have very little talent for flattery. Good. He finally turned to face her. Then I suppose we have an arrangement, Miss Hartwell. My solicitor will draw up a settlement that ensures your security regardless of what happens. You will want for nothing materially. Except love, Eleanor said quietly. The words struck him harder than they should have. Except that, he agreed. I cannot give what I do not possess. Then we are perfectly matched, Eleanor said, for I stopped believing in love years ago. They stood in the portrait gallery, two people negotiating the terms of their own emotional imprisonment, and Marcus wondered if this was how all great mistakes began, with the best intentions and the deepest despairs colliding in the dark. When, Eleanor asked, when should this arrangement take place? As soon as it can be quietly managed. Special license, small ceremony, there's no point in making a spectacle of it. Agreed. She moved toward the door, then paused. Your Grace, may I see Oliver? Before we formalize this arrangement, I should like to see him once more, to be certain I can truly help him. Marcus felt a strange tightness in his chest. He's sleeping. The nightmares usually come around midnight. Then I'll stay until midnight, and if he wakes screaming, perhaps I can— You would wait here for hours on the chance that you might be useful? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I told you, Your Grace, I understand what it means to be unwanted. I also understand what it means when someone finally sees you. If I can be that person for Oliver, then yes, I'll wait. Marcus found himself nodding, though this entire situation had spiraled far beyond his control. Mrs. Davies will show you to the blue sitting room. It's closest to the nursery wing. Thank you. Eleanor started to leave, then turned back one more time. Your Grace, this arrangement we're making, I know you see it as a necessary evil, a transaction to save your son. But I want you to know that I don't consider it a sacrifice. For the first time in years, I feel like I might actually have a purpose. Whatever else happens, I'm grateful for that. She left before he could respond, her worn skirts whispering against the floor, and Marcus was left alone with his late wife's portrait and the echoing silence of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Eleanor had barely been seated in the blue sitting room for 20 minutes when the screaming started. It was a sound that would haunt her forever, A child's voice raw with terror, crying out for a mother who couldn't answer. She didn't wait for permission. She gathered her skirts and ran toward the sound, reaching the nursery just as a harried-looking maid emerged. "Miss, you shouldn't." But Eleanor was already pushing past her, into a room where a small boy thrashed in his bed, caught in the grip of some invisible horror. The Duke was already there, trying to hold his son, but Oliver was fighting him with surprising strength. "No, no, you're not her. You're not Mama. She left. She didn't love me enough." "Oliver!" The Duke's voice cracked with desperation. "Son, please!" Eleanor didn't think. She simply moved to the bed and began to sing. It was an old lullaby, one her own mother had supposedly sung, though Eleanor had no memory of it. Her father had taught it to her once, in a rare moment of softness, saying it was all he had left of his late wife. The effect was immediate. Oliver's thrashing slowed. His eyes, wild with nightmare terror, began to focus. Eleanor kept singing, her voice soft but steady, and slowly, so slowly, the boy's breathing began to regulate. Marcus stepped back, watching with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. When Oliver finally sagged against the pillows, exhausted, Eleanor gently brushed the sweat-damped hair from his forehead. "There now," she murmured. "The nightmares can't hurt you. They're just shadows, and shadows disappear in the light." "Who are you?" Oliver whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "My name is Eleanor. I'm a friend of your father's." "And I'm going to tell you a secret if you promise to keep it safe." The boy's eyes, so like his father's, watched her with cautious hope. "What secret?" "I used to have nightmares too, terrible ones. I would dream that I was alone in a great empty house, and no matter how much I called out, no one would answer. I thought I would be alone forever." "What made them stop?" Oliver asked, his small hand unconsciously reaching for hers. Eleanor felt her throat tighten but kept her voice steady. "I learned that being alone and being lonely are different things. And I learned that sometimes the people who understand us best are the ones who've been lonely too." "Are you lonely?" the boy asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Yes," Eleanor admitted, "very lonely. But I'm hoping that might change." Oliver studied her for a long moment, then asked the question that nearly broke her heart. "Will you leave too? Everyone leaves eventually." Eleanor looked up at Marcus, standing in the shadows, and saw something in his expression, permission, perhaps, or simply shared pain. She turned back to Oliver and spoke the truth that would bind her to this family more surely than any marriage vow. "Oliver, I'm going to marry your father. I'm going to become your new mama. And I promise you, on everything I hold sacred, that I will never, ever leave you by choice. You will have to be the one to send me away, and I rather hope you won't, because I think you and I could be quite good friends." The boy's eyes went wide. "You're going to be my mama? If you'll have me. I know I'm not what you might have imagined. I'm not very pretty, and I can't sing very well, and I have absolutely no idea how to be a proper duchess. But I know how to love a child who's been hurt, and I know how to be there day after day when the nightmares come." Oliver looked at his father. "Papa, is this true?" Marcus moved back into the light, and Eleanor saw that his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Yes, son. Miss Hartwell has agreed to become my wife and your mother, if that's acceptable to you." To Eleanor's shock, Oliver launched himself at her, wrapping his thin arms around her neck with desperate strength. "Please, don't change your mind," he whispered against her shoulder. "Please, please don't change your mind." Eleanor held him close, feeling tears slip down her own cheeks. "I won't, I promise. We're going to be a family, You and I and your father. It might not be a perfect family, but it will be ours." Over the boy's head, she met Marcus' gaze. What she saw there was gratitude, yes, but also something else, a dawning awareness that what they had agreed to was no longer simple. They had thought to make a business arrangement, a cold transaction to solve practical problems. But Oliver had changed the equation. In accepting this child's desperate need for love, Eleanor had committed herself to something far more complicated than a marriage of convenience. She had committed herself to the impossible task of teaching a lonely boy to trust again. And in the process, she suspected, she would have to learn to trust as well. Marcus watched his son cling to this woman he barely knew and felt something twist painfully in his chest. He had thought himself beyond such feelings, had thought the war and grief had burned away anything soft inside him. But watching Eleanor hold Oliver, watching her make promises she might not be able to keep, watching his son hope again for the first time in months, it terrified him. Because hope was dangerous. Hope could be destroyed. And if this fragile arrangement fell apart, if Eleanor Hartwell proved unable to bear the weight of their needs, it would destroy Oliver completely. "Miss Hartwell," Marcus said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss the practical arrangements. Tomorrow, in my study?" Eleanor looked up, still holding Oliver. "Of course, Your Grace. But for tonight, if it's acceptable, I'd like to stay here." "Until Oliver is truly asleep. I'll have Mrs. Davies prepare the adjoining room. You can stay the night if needed. Thank you." She turned her attention back to Oliver, already beginning another soft lullaby. Marcus left them there, the spinster saint and his broken son, and walked the darkened halls of his ancestral home. He had survived war, injury, loss, and loneliness. He had thought himself hardened against any further damage. But as he listened to Eleanor's soft singing drift through the quiet house, Marcus realized that he had just invited a very different kind of danger into his carefully controlled world. The danger of caring, the danger of hoping, the danger that this practical arrangement might become something far more complicated, and the most terrifying danger of all, that Eleanor Hartwell, with her steady gray eyes and her understanding of loneliness, might be the one person who could finally break through the walls he'd built around his heart. He poured himself a brandy in his study and stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. In 3 days, he would marry a woman he barely knew. He would give her his name, his home, his son, everything except his heart, because that, Marcus told himself firmly, was one thing he would never risk again. But even as he made that promise to himself, he knew it was already a lie. The moment Oliver had wrapped his arms around Eleanor Hartwell, the moment she had promised to stay, the moment Marcus had seen something besides despair in his son's eyes, everything had changed, and there was no going back. The wedding, when it occurred 3 days later, was exactly as Marcus had planned, small, quiet, and utterly devoid of romance. The vicar, Eleanor's own father, performed the ceremony in Ashbourne's private chapel with only Mrs. Davies and Oliver as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple gray dress with no ornamentation. Marcus wore his formal attire but no smile. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising before God to honor and cherish, knowing that at least half of those promises would remain forever unfulfilled. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus placed a perfunctory kiss on Eleanor's cheek. She didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of disappointment. She simply turned to Oliver, who had been clutching her hand throughout the ceremony, and said, "Well then, my darling, shall we go home?" The word home struck Marcus with unexpected force. This house had been many things, his ancestral seat, his prison, his refuge, but home? Not for years, perhaps never. But watching Eleanor walk toward the manor with Oliver chattering excitedly beside her, Marcus felt the strangest sensation. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they had not made a terrible mistake after all. The first weeks of the marriage passed in an odd sort of domestic ballet. Eleanor threw herself into motherhood with fierce determination, spending hours with Oliver in ways that scandalized the servants. She didn't delegate to governesses or nannies. She was the one who read to him, walked with him, listened to his endless questions about insects to ancient Rome. Marcus watched from a distance, as he had always watched his own life unfold, and was startled by the transformation in his son. Oliver began to eat properly. His nightmares decreased. He smiled, laughed, ran through the gardens with an energy Marcus had thought lost forever. And Eleanor herself, she was unlike any duchess Marcus had ever encountered. She ignored every social convention that didn't serve a practical purpose. She had her breakfast in the library, often forgetting to appear until noon. She walked the estates in worn boots, talking to tenants and learning their names. She turned the formal drawing room into a schoolroom where she taught Oliver and several tenant children together, declaring that learning is improved by company. His peers thought him mad, of course. The Duke of Ashbourne, war hero and pillar of society, had married a penniless spinster and allowed her to turn his household upside down. The gossip was merciless. Marcus found, to his surprise, that he didn't care. "Your Grace?" Eleanor appeared in his study one evening, Oliver already asleep. She rarely sought him out in private, maintaining the careful distance they had agreed upon. "I need to discuss something with you." "Of course. Please, sit." She perched on the edge of the chair across from his desk, her posture rigid. Even after weeks of marriage, she still seemed uncomfortable in his presence. "It's about the Harvest Festival. The tenants are expecting the Duke and Duchess to attend, to present prizes and lead the first dance." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "You know I don't dance." "Yes, but they don't know that. And it would mean a great deal to them, and to Oliver, if we at least made an appearance together, as a family." The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Family. They had used the word with Oliver, but between themselves, they had maintained the careful fiction that this was merely an arrangement. "I suppose we must keep up appearances," Marcus said stiffly. Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps? But she simply nodded. "Of course, appearances. That's all I meant." She rose to leave, and Marcus found himself saying, "Eleanor, wait." She turned, and in the lamplight, he saw her properly for perhaps the first time since their wedding. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hair had come partially loose from its pins. She looked tired, but content, and there was a warmth in her expression when she spoke of Oliver that had never been there when she looked at him. "You've been good for him," Marcus said. "Better than I could have hoped. I wanted you to know that I am grateful." "He's easy to love," Eleanor said softly. "He's bright and curious and kind. You should be very proud of him." "I am. But I had very little to do with those qualities. That's all your influence." Eleanor shook her head. "No, that's all Oliver. I simply gave him permission to be himself, something he should have had all along." The implicit criticism stung, but Marcus couldn't deny its truth. "You're right. I failed him. Before you came." "You were doing your best," Eleanor said, and her tone gentled. "You can't give what you weren't given yourself. But you can learn, if you want to." Marcus looked at her, this woman he had married out of desperation, and felt something shift inside him. "Teach me," he heard himself say. "Show me how to be warmer, for Oliver's sake." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and he saw her weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. All right, but it won't be easy. You'll have to let down some of those walls, Your Grace. You'll have to risk being vulnerable. I survived war. I can survive vulnerability. A small, sad smile touched her lips. War is easier, I think. At least with war, you know who your enemies are. She left before he could respond, and Marcus was left alone with the uncomfortable realization that Eleanor Hartwell, now Eleanor Thornfield, saw through him far more clearly than he'd ever intended. The harvest festival arrived with golden autumn sunshine and the crisp promise of winter to come. The estate grounds had been transformed into a fairground, with games and food stalls and a large pavilion for dancing. The tenants had dressed in their finest, and there was an air of celebration that made even Marcus's cold heart lift slightly. Eleanor had surprised him by appearing in a new dress, nothing extravagant, but a deep green that brought out hints of gold in her gray eyes. She'd allowed her hair to be properly dressed for the first time since their wedding, and Marcus found himself staring at her longer than appropriate. "Will I do?" she asked, and there was a nervousness in her voice he'd never heard before. "You look lovely," Marcus said, and meant it. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. I wanted Oliver to be proud. He's been so excited about this day." As if summoned, Oliver came racing up, nearly tripping in his new shoes. "Papa! Mama! Can we go see the puppies? Mrs. Barnes's dog had puppies, and she said I could hold one." "Mama." The word still struck Marcus every time Oliver said it, but Eleanor simply laughed and took the boy's hand. "Of course, but perhaps your father would like to come too." Oliver looked up at Marcus with hopeful eyes, and Marcus found himself nodding. "Lead the way." They walked through the festival together, and Marcus was acutely aware of how they must look, a family. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne with their son, smiling and greeting tenants. It was exactly what he'd wanted when he proposed this arrangement, the appearance of normalcy. But somewhere along the way, it had stopped being an appearance. When Oliver laughed at the puppy's antics, Marcus felt his chest tighten with genuine joy. When Eleanor gently corrected the boy's over-enthusiastic handling of the animals, Marcus saw the patience and love that guided every one of her interactions. And when she glanced up at him, checking his reaction, he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Hope. She was hoping he would engage, would participate, would be part of this moment, rather than simply observing it. So Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He knelt down beside his son and picked up one of the puppies, letting the squirming creature lick his face while Oliver giggled with delight. "Papa, you're playing!" Such a simple observation, such a devastating indictment of how he'd been living. Marcus looked up at Eleanor and saw tears in her eyes, quickly blinked away. "Yes," Marcus said softly, "I suppose I am." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Marcus found himself talking to tenants, truly talking to them, rather than simply issuing commands. He watched Eleanor organize a game for the children, her laughter genuine and free. He saw Oliver running with other children, no longer the isolated, melancholy boy who'd sobbed in his arms weeks ago. And he realized, with a sensation very like falling, that this was what he'd been missing. This warmth, this connection, this sense of being part of something larger than his own pain and duty. When evening came and the dancing began, Marcus knew what he had to do. He found Eleanor standing at the edge of the pavilion, watching the festivities with a wistful expression. "Dance with me," he said. She startled, turning to face him. "Your Grace, you said you don't." "I don't. But you were right. Appearances matter. And," he held out his hand, "I find I want to, if you'll have me." Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a dangerous animal. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. "I should warn you, I'm not very graceful." "Neither am I." "Well, muddle through together." They walked onto the dance floor. and Marcus placed his hand on Eleanor's waist, feeling her tense slightly at the contact. It was the most intimate they'd been since their wedding kiss, and Marcus was suddenly intensely aware of her. The warmth of her body, the scent of lavender in her hair, the way her gray eyes reflected the lantern light. The music began, and they moved together with all the grace of two people who had never danced with each other before. Marcus stepped on her foot. She stumbled over his. They were hopelessly out of sync, and yet Eleanor began to laugh. Not a polite, restrained laugh, but a full, joyous sound that made something crack inside Marcus' chest. And then, impossibly, he was laughing too. "We're terrible at this," Eleanor gasped. "Absolutely appalling," Marcus agreed, and spun her, poorly, making her laugh harder. They continued their graceless dance, and Marcus realized that every eye in the pavilion was on them. His tenants were watching their duke, the cold, severe Duke of Ashbourne, laugh and stumble and dance with his unusual wife. And they were smiling because this was what they'd hoped for: humanity in their lord, warmth in their lady, and a family that felt real rather than merely dutiful. When the song finally ended, Marcus found he didn't want to let Eleanor go. She was still smiling, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with happiness. She looked, in that moment, almost beautiful. "Thank you," she said, softly, "for trying." "Thank you," Marcus replied, "for teaching me how." Oliver came running up, demanding they watch him try the ring toss, and the moment passed. But as they walked through the festival together, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years: the possibility that happiness might not be entirely out of reach. That night, after Oliver had been put to bed and the guests had departed, Marcus found Eleanor in the library. She was curled in a chair by the fire, already back in her usual worn dress, reading by candlelight. "May I join you?" he asked. She looked up, surprised. "Of course. This is your library, Your Grace." "Marcus," he said, sitting across from her. "When we're alone, call me Marcus." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "That seems informal, given our arrangement." "Our arrangement," Marcus said carefully, "was made under circumstances that have since changed. Oliver adores you. You've brought life back to this house. And today, I realized that I've been clinging to our initial terms out of fear rather than logic." "Of what?" "Of caring, of hoping, of risking the pain that comes when you let someone close enough to hurt you." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But watching you today, seeing Oliver happy, feeling that perhaps I might actually be part of a real family. Eleanor, I don't want this to be merely an arrangement anymore." She set down her book, her expression carefully neutral. "What do you want it to be?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I don't know how to be a husband in truth. I don't know how to love, or if I'm even capable of it after everything that's happened. But I'd like to try, if you're willing." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus felt his heart pound in a way it hadn't since his first battle. Finally, she spoke. "I'm afraid." "Of me?" "Of hope," she corrected. "I've spent so many years teaching myself not to want more than survival, and now you're asking me to risk hoping for actual happiness. That's terrifying, Marcus." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips made something warm bloom in his chest. "I know," he said, "but perhaps we could be terrified together. Perhaps we could try, slowly, to build something real from this arrangement we made." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw her weighing the risk, calculating the potential for pain. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Slowly," she agreed. "We'll try. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. I'm not your first wife. I'm not beautiful or accomplished or socially adept. If we're going to attempt this, you have to accept me as I am, odd and bookish and entirely unsuitable. "You're not unsuitable," Marcus said firmly. "You're extraordinary. You brought my son back from the edge of despair. You made this house feel like a home. You made me laugh for the first time in years. If those things make you unsuitable, then I want nothing to do with suitable." Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes. "You don't have to say such things. I'm not saying them because I have to. I'm saying them because they're true. And Eleanor, one of the things I promised you was honesty. So I'm being honest now." "You terrify me. This terrifies me. But I think it might be worth the fear." Eleanor wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unrefined that it made Marcus's heart clench. Then, "Well, try. Together. Slowly." "Together," Marcus agreed. "Slowly." They sat in comfortable silence after that, Eleanor returning to her book while Marcus simply watched the fire. It wasn't a grand declaration of love. There were no passionate kisses or sweeping romantic gestures, but it was a beginning, tentative and fragile, but real. And for the first time since Amelia's death, Marcus allowed himself to believe that perhaps his life wasn't over. Perhaps there was still a chance for something more than mere survival. Perhaps, just perhaps, he might actually find happiness with this unusual woman who had stumbled into his life at exactly the moment he needed her most. The slow rebuilding of Marcus and Eleanor's relationship happened in small moments that accumulated like snowfall, barely noticeable individually, but transformative in aggregate. Marcus began joining Eleanor and Oliver for breakfast, something he'd never done with Amelia. He found he enjoyed the boys' endless questions and Eleanor's patient, thoughtful answers. He even contributed his own knowledge occasionally and saw Eleanor's surprised pleasure when he did. Eleanor, for her part, began seeking Marcus's opinion on household matters, then on tenant issues, then, remarkably, on the books she was reading. Their conversation stretched longer, became deeper, touched on topics Marcus hadn't discussed with anyone in years. One evening, approximately 2 months after the Harvest Festival, Marcus experienced his first nightmare in Eleanor's presence. He woke gasping, the phantom sounds of cannon fire still echoing in his ears, to find her standing beside his bed in her nightgown, a candle in her hand. "I heard you shouting," she said softly. "May I?" He nodded, not trusting his voice, and she sat on the edge of his bed, a shocking intimacy given their arrangement. She didn't try to touch him or comfort him with empty words. She simply sat there, present and solid, until his breathing normalized. "The war?" she asked finally. "Always the war, or Amelia's death, or some combination of both." His voice came out rough. "I thought I'd learned to control it." "You can't control trauma, Marcus. You can only learn to live with it." She set down the candle. "My mother died bearing me. For years, my father would wake screaming from nightmares about it. I would sit with him, just like this, until the ghosts released him." Marcus looked at her in the candlelight, this woman he'd married out of desperation, and felt something crack open inside him. "I'm broken, Eleanor. The war broke something inside me, and I don't think it can be fixed." "I don't think you're broken, Eleanor," Eleanor said gently. "I think you're wounded. That's different. Wounds can heal, even if they leave scars. What if I can't heal? What if this is all I am now, a man haunted by ghosts, incapable of being the husband or father you and Oliver deserve?" Eleanor reached out then, her hand covering his. It was the first time she'd touched him with tenderness, and Marcus felt it like an electric shock. "Marcus, you've been healing since the day we married. You just haven't noticed because you're looking for grand transformations instead of small ones. But I've noticed. I've seen you laugh with Oliver. I've seen you gentle with the tenants. I've seen you trying every day to be warmer and more present. That's healing. It's just slow and painful and imperfect. Marcus turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. How did you become so wise? Loneliness is an excellent teacher. It strips away all the pretty illusions and forces you to see things as they truly are. She smiled sadly. I spent so many years alone that I learned to see the truth in people. You're a good man, Marcus. A wounded one, yes, but good. And goodness is worth more than perfection. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, not speaking. When Eleanor finally rose to return to her own room, Marcus caught her hand. "Stay," he said. Not for anything improper. Just stay. I sleep better when I'm not alone." Eleanor hesitated, and Marcus saw her weighing propriety against compassion. Then she nodded and settled into the chair beside his bed, pulling a blanket over herself. "Sleep, Marcus. I'll be here if the nightmares return." He did sleep, better than he had in months, and when he woke at dawn, Eleanor was still there, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, her book fallen to the floor. Marcus gently lifted her and carried her to his bed, tucking her in before retreating to his study. Let the servants gossip. He didn't care. Eleanor had given him peace, and that was worth any scandal. From that night on, the dynamic between them shifted. They were no longer merely polite associates sharing a house. They were becoming partners, friends, and perhaps, though neither dared say it aloud, something more. Oliver noticed the change, of course. Children always do. He began maneuvering to have his parents sit together, hold hands, share books. He was delighted when they announced they would start taking family walks in the evening, all three of them together. "We're a real family now," Oliver said one evening, walking between Marcus and Eleanor, holding both their hands. "Aren't we, Papa? Aren't we, Mama?" Marcus looked at Eleanor over their son's head and saw his own cautious hope reflected in her eyes. "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "Yes, my darling. We're a real family." And in that moment, Marcus realized he'd fallen in love with his own wife. The revelation struck him with the force of a cavalry charge. He loved Eleanor Thornfield, her intelligence, her kindness, her stubborn refusal to accept less than honesty. He loved the way she read to Oliver, the way she challenged him in conversation, the way she looked at Dawn with her hair unbound. He loved her completely, desperately, and with a terror that made his war experiences seem tame by comparison. Because Eleanor had made no secret of the fact that she'd stopped believing in love years ago. She had married him for practical reasons, had agreed to try for a real relationship, but she had never promised to love him. And Marcus had no idea how to tell her that he'd broken their unspoken agreement by developing feelings she might never reciprocate. That night, alone in his study, Marcus penned a letter he would never send. "My dearest Eleanor, I have broken our bargain. We agreed to honesty, so I must confess. I have fallen in love with you. Not the desperate love of youth, but something deeper. A love built on respect and admiration and the daily miracle of your presence in my life. I love the way you listen to Oliver as if his every word matters. I love how you challenge me to be better without making me feel inadequate. I love your terrible dancing and your stubborn insistence on reading at breakfast and the way you scrunch your nose when you're concentrating. I know this is not what we agreed to. I know you married me for security and purpose, not affection. And I swear to you, I will never burden you with these feelings if they're unwelcome. I will be content with friendship, with partnership, with whatever you're willing to give." But I needed to write it down, even if only to burn this letter afterward. I needed to admit, at least to myself, that you have become essential to my happiness. You and Oliver. You are my family in truth now, not mere arrangement. and I would do anything to keep you both safe and happy. Forever yours, Marcus. He read the letter twice, then held it to the candle flame and watched it burn. Some truths were too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Better to love her in silence than to risk losing what they had already built. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The crisis came on a cold December evening, 3 months into their marriage. Marcus returned from a meeting with his solicitor in London to find the house in chaos. Servants rushed through the halls with hot water and blankets. Mrs. Davies looked frantic. "What's happened?" Marcus demanded, his heart in his throat. "It's Oliver, Your Grace. He was playing near the pond and fell through the ice. Her Grace pulled him out, but they're both—" She gestured upward, unable to finish. Marcus took the stairs 3 at a time, his blood roaring in his ears. He burst into Oliver's room to find his son in bed, pale but conscious, wrapped in blankets. The physician was there, examining him. "He'll be fine," the doctor said immediately, seeing Marcus's expression. "Cold and frightened, but no lasting damage. However, Your Grace, you should see to the Duchess. She—" But Marcus was already moving to Eleanor's adjoining room. He found her there, still in her wet clothes, shivering violently. Her lips were blue, and she couldn't seem to stop shaking. "Eleanor!" He rushed to her side, began stripping off the wet garments without thought for propriety. "Why aren't you in dry clothes? Why hasn't anyone—" "She refused," Mrs. Davies said, appearing in the doorway with more blankets. "She insisted we see to Master Oliver first. She wouldn't let anyone attend her until she knew he was safe." Marcus felt something break inside him. Of course she had. Of course Eleanor would risk her own health, her own life, for their son. Because that was who she was, selfless to the point of self-destruction. He wrapped her in blankets and carried her to his own room, where the fire was already blazing. He laid her in his bed and climbed in beside her, pulling her against his chest, trying to warm her with his own body heat. "Marcus," she managed through chattering teeth. "Improper. Damn propriety," he said roughly. "You nearly died saving our son. I'm not leaving you. Oliver is fine. You heard the doctor. He'll be perfectly well. But you stubborn, foolish, wonderful woman, stayed in wet clothes in freezing temperatures because you put everyone else first." Eleanor's shivering began to slowly subside as his warmth seeped into her. "It's my son," she said simply. "What else would I do?" Marcus held her tighter, his face buried in her damp hair. "You could have died. Do you understand that? You could have died. And his voice broke. "I can't lose you, Eleanor. I can't." "You barely know me," she mumbled, exhaustion making her words slur. "We've only been married 3 months." "I know you better than I've ever known anyone," Marcus said fiercely. "I know that you're brave and kind and selfless. I know that you've given me and Oliver something we never thought we'd have. I know that He stopped, the confession catching in his throat, but Eleanor had gone still in his arms, and when he looked down, her gray eyes were locked on his face. "You what?" she whispered. Marcus knew this was his moment. He could retreat to safety, could maintain the careful boundaries they'd established, or he could take the greatest risk of his life and tell her the truth. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that's not what we agreed to. I know you married me for practical reasons. But Eleanor, I love you. I love everything about you. And the thought of losing you, of this world continuing without you in it, is unbearable." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Marcus!" "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted, unable to bear hearing her gentle rejection. "I don't expect you to return the feeling. I just needed you to know. In case something had happened today, I couldn't bear the thought that you might never know." "You foolish man," Eleanor said, and she was crying now, tears streaming down her cold cheeks. "You absolute fool! Did you really think I didn't love you?" Marcus froze. "What?" "I love you," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I've loved you for weeks now, maybe longer. I love the way you try so hard to be warm, even though it doesn't come naturally. I love how gentle you are with Oliver, even when you're afraid of doing it wrong. I love your nightmares, because they remind me you're human. I love your terrible dancing, and your honesty, and the way you look at me sometimes like I'm something precious." Marcus felt as if he couldn't breathe. You love me?" "Of course I love you, you ridiculous man. I married you thinking it would be a business arrangement, and instead you gave me a family, a purpose, and a man worth loving. How could I not fall in love with you?" Marcus kissed her then, properly, for the first time since their wedding. And unlike that perfunctory peck in the chapel, this kiss was everything a kiss should be, desperate and tender and full of promise. Eleanor's cold lips warmed under his, and when they finally broke apart, they were both crying. "I thought I'd never be loved," Eleanor whispered against his mouth. "I thought I was too odd, too old, too plain." "You're perfect," Marcus said fiercely. "You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I thank God every day that you were desperate enough to propose to me." Eleanor laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Two broken people who stumbled into healing each other." "The best pairs usually are," Marcus said, kissing her again. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, no longer needing to maintain the careful distance they'd once thought necessary. When Eleanor finally fell asleep, exhausted from her ordeal, Marcus held her and marveled at the impossible gift he'd been given. He'd married her to give Oliver a mother. But Eleanor had given him something far greater. She'd given him a family, yes, but also hope, healing, and love. She taught him that broken things could be mended, that cold hearts could warm, and that sometimes the most practical arrangements could transform into the greatest love stories. When Oliver came padding into the room later, worried about his mother, Marcus simply lifted the blankets and let the boy climb in between them. Eleanor stirred, smiled sleepily, and wrapped her arm around Oliver, pulling him close. And there they stayed, the three of them, tangled together in Marcus's great bed, the Duke of Ashbourne, his unlikely Duchess, and the son they both adored. A family, real and whole, imperfect, and absolutely perfect. Epilogue, 5 years later. The Duchess of Ashbourne stood in the portrait gallery, studying the painting that had just been unveiled. The artist had captured them beautifully. Marcus in his formal attire, looking stern but with warmth in his eyes. Oliver, now 12, standing tall and confident. Little Amelia, their daughter, perched on Eleanor's lap with a book in her small hands. And baby James, named for Marcus's fallen comrade, cradled in his father's arms. But what made Eleanor's throat tighten was how the artist had painted them. Not as formal aristocrats maintaining proper distance, but as a family clearly in love with each other. Marcus's hand rested on her shoulder, Oliver leaned against his father's side, and all of them were smiling, really, truly smiling. "Do you like it?" Marcus asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder, in a gesture that would have scandalized him years ago. "I love it," Eleanor said honestly, "though I still think the artist made me too pretty." "Impossible," Marcus said, kissing her neck. "You're exactly as beautiful as he painted you, more so, actually." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man she'd married out of desperation and come to love with her entire being. "Do you remember our wedding day?" "How could I forget? I married the most unsuitable, extraordinary woman in England." "You married a practical solution to a problem," Eleanor corrected with a smile, "and look what happened." Marcus glanced at the portrait, at the family they'd built from desperation and hope. I thought I was just giving Oliver a mother, but you gave us all something far greater. What's that? Each other, Marcus said simply. You taught me that love isn't something you're born knowing how to do. It's something you learn, day by day, with someone patient enough to teach you. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears, which still sometimes surprised her. And you taught me that I was worth loving, that being odd and bookish and terrible at dancing didn't make me unworthy of happiness. Papa! Mama! Oliver's voice echoed through the gallery. Amelia's trying to read my Latin homework again, and James won't stop crying unless you sing that terrible lullaby. They looked at each other and laughed, the sound echoing through the gallery that had once held only ghosts and regrets. Shall we? Marcus offered his arm. Always, Eleanor said, taking it. They walked together toward the noise and chaos of their children, toward the life they'd built from broken pieces, toward a future that once seemed impossible but now felt inevitable. The Duke had married her to give his son a mother, but she had given him a family he never dreamed of, a family built not on duty or obligation, but on love learned slowly, carefully, and completely. And in the end, that made all the difference.